I've always said you're the most interesting man in comics and everything, and for me it was like there was legends about you because we didn't really know you, like you sort of did your own thing. Everybody else was kind of wanting to work in America where you were wanting to go to Europe, So I'd always hear legends about you, although I didn't hang out with you or anything, but I remember hearing, for example, that you were in a cult in France and you had 12 wives or something like that. And I remember I heard this back in the 90s and I was like, bloody hell, what's the story behind all that? Because I think there's a seed of truth in there, isn't there?
Absolutely, yeah.
Hey, you lucky devils, just to let you know, we've got 5 new comics out this year from Dark Horse Comics. Nemesis Rogues Gallery is out in July. Prodigy 3 is out in August. Nightclub 2 also out in August. The Magic Order's big finale, Volume 5, is out in September, and the Jupiter's Legacy finale is finally here in October. Also out from Dark Horse this year, we have the Wanted and Big Game hardcover, a huge library edition, and the Ambassadors with all your favourite artists collected into one big beautiful hardcover in November. Don't miss it.
Hey, hi,
Hey
Mark.
there, Pat. How you doing?
All right, I put some headphones on because they may help your recording, I think.
Fantastic. I always think it looks cool. It looks like you mean business when you're wearing the headphones. I like it. How you doing anyway?
I'm doing fine. How are you? How's things?
It's pretty cold because I know you're in Spain now, aren't you? You're out in sunny climes.
It's lovely. It's warm, but it shouldn't be this warm. January, February. You feel a bit guilty about it. You think, what am I doing in a t-shirt in January and February? Well, especially, you can understand how I feel as a Scot.
Were you there for Christmas? Did you have a hot Christmas then?
Yeah. Oh, yeah. I mean, the weather's great generally. I mean, we're just about an hour and a half from less than that actually, Gibraltar.
Right.
So we're up in the mountains. So, we're pretty close. From my office window, which I'm looking out now, you can see Africa.
Amazing.
So.
It's good if you need to escape. You can get there if you need to escape. Yeah. See, I like the idea that you're in some Costa del Crime situation, that you're out there. You did it. You pulled a big job, and then you disappeared to the Costa del Crime.
That's more the coast, and that is true. That whole Life on Mars thing. We were on the coast for a number of years, and we did gather some material, both myself and Lisa, for possible, future reference, because you can't resist it. I'm sure where you are, if you've got neighbors down the road who are acting in a certain way, you're going to think, my God, that will make a good story. So.
Well, I've got loads of oligarchs. There seems to be a load of oligarchs around me, so people come in from Russia and all these kind of things, stay here for a little while, then move on. But they're all very interesting, very social, very nice.
Yeah. Where are you, in London or in Glasgow?
I moved from Glasgow about 2.5 years ago. My wife's English. And we wanted to, as our parents were getting a little bit older, we thought it'd be nice to be sort of down. So we're down Suffolk way. We're down in Suffolk just now,
Suffolk? So. Well, that's my home county.
Of course, yeah, because that was a kind of hub for the British comic scene, wasn't it? Because Alan Grant, John Wagner were all that neck of the woods.
Well, I went down there first, and then John joined me, and then Alan joined John. And that's how that sort of particular thing worked. But we're talking Colchester and Ipswich. So whereabouts in Suffolk?
Bury St Edmunds, like quite near Bury St Edmunds.
Oh, very well.
Yeah. So
the oligarchs are down the road from you, eh?
Good place to hide. You're in the middle of the countryside, just surrounded by farms. If anybody's coming to kill you, you can see them coming in the distance. You can get your gun out,
Yeah. No, Bury St Edmunds is lovely.
Yeah, it's nice.
And I think... I have no criticisms to make of Bury St Edmunds whatsoever. So it's a lovely. You got the Angel Inn and all that kind of stuff, and was it Great Bromley or somewhere like that? I was outside Bury St Edmunds for a while, so I sort of know the area.
So what took you to Spain? I mean, because I assume you're the most British comic book creator. Like I think of you. It's often been said you're the godfather of British comics. I mean, I'd say if a Terminator had to go back in time and destroy the British comics industry, they would shoot you as a child, like you're the linchpin of it all, So the idea of you not in the UK is like the Ravens leaving the Tower of London, when did you go? What happened?
Well, I mean, I've traveled around Europe a fair amount anyway.
Yeah.
So it wasn't that much of a shock, if you like. But my wife grew up in Spain and speaks fluent Spanish. And, well, it's warmer, it's cheaper, it's, all those various pluses. I mean, there are some minuses, like the bureaucracy is a lot worse than in Britain, I think. But that aside, everything else is pretty good. So no, I've always liked. I mean, I thought for a while back living in France, because I do work for French comic books and things like that. So yeah, it felt very natural, really, for me. And of course, with Zoom and Skype and so on, it's the days where it might have been a problem are really over. And the only challenge, as when you travel by Ryanair or EasyJet or whatever, 50% chance you're going to get a cold, maybe. I don't know. I'd say it's pretty high, or at least it is in my case. I feel quite vulnerable in that direction. So
I do it once a month as well, because I fly back to Scotland once a month, and I'm on Ryanair's the only way to get from the airport at Stansted up to Glasgow, and you're sick within 2 days. I've been on the plane. You're always sick within. So
I'm not being paranoid.
No, every time I get it,
Yeah, that's a bit of a bummer, isn't it? That inevitable, and you doubtless do all those sniffing stuff, legal stuff, and so on to kind of, protect yourself. And does it work? I don't know. And you put stuff on your hands so you're not. See, to be honest, I mean, our house is a germ factory. Like, my youngest is 9. And she just basically comes in every day with a new virus, children at that age are just vectors for all viruses, aren't they? So I just accept for about the next 5 years, I'm just going to constantly have a runny nose. It's just the way it goes, So I guess so. Yeah. Kids would be. Yeah. I mean,
nightmare.
Who'd be a teacher for that reason alone? My God, it's a scary thought, isn't it?
Well, to fill in any Americans who might be unaware of your legendary status, as I say, godfather of British comics, created the most important British comic of all time. I mean, without question, 2000 AD, which is, I always describe 2000 AD as being like the Oxford or Cambridge, the Oxbridge for the British comic book scene. Like, everybody who's had a career in comics has come through 2000 AD, essentially. This is the alma mater, isn't it, for British comics. I mean, Alan Moore, everybody, everybody who's sprung from there. But it all goes back to yourself, John Wagner, and Alan Grant. Specifically, I think you and John at the very beginning. But you created it, co-created Judge Dredd, all the amazing stuff you've done yourself, for 2000 AD, like ABC Warriors, Slain, Nemesis the Warlock, it's mind-blowing the work you were doing for 2000 and then where it's gone since. I mean, as a writer myself, I just love the fact that you've still managed to stay cool. Most guys have a parabolic curve to their career, don't they? Where they go a bit soft and then they go a bit boring and all that, and they tail off after 10, 20 years. You've been doing this since I was 7, right? I mean, 2000 AD since I was 7. You've been doing comics since I was born, and yet I think your stuff is as relevant as it's ever been. I don't know how you've done it. There's a few guys in history have managed to keep it going in pop culture, but what is your longevity? How do you pull it off?
I think there's 2 reasons. One is I saw what had happened to a previous generation. Yeah. And you must have done the same thing looking at my generation. And I think that was worth just mentioning, really, that John Wagner and I, we looked at the previous generation. Mm-hmm. And that's maybe worth a moment or two, because various people try to beat the system. We all try to beat the system because the system in Britain is crap. There's no 2 ways about it. It's shameful. It's disgusting. Rant. okay, putting that to one side, the previous generation were, had talent, just like your generation, just like mine. So what did they do? Well, it's interesting to see that in action. Some of them went to the US quite early on. Barry Windsor Smith, I think, is an example. I think you would, one would include Steve Bell, who worked for these terrible comics that I worked for, the funnies, which were extremely unfunny. So that's what happened to a couple of them.
Yeah.
And then and bear in mind, I'm observing all this as a, 21-year-old, and I'm thinking, okay, what did the previous generation do? So I either follow suit with them or don't make the same mistakes.
Yeah.
And so then you had Ken Reed, who I think burnt out. Great talent, who's possibly not known in the States. Jonah and Faceache and lots of other absolute genius. Now, if he'd worked for France, as I do, they'd probably give him a medal from the French president. Seriously.
Yeah.
And instead, he had, I think, a relatively short and tragic life. I don't know the details exactly. So that was him, right? So I'm making a mental note of this and thinking, well, I'm not going to burn out like this guy, right? And then you have Leo Baxendale, Bash Street Kids, and many other things. And he took on DC Thompson's. So this was one of the things that I suppose I thought, and of course I'm completely wrong, and I don't wish to denigrate your generation, but I'm going to anyway. I always thought of things as being onwards and upwards. Yeah. So I thought, well, his generation are quite militant because Leo Baxendale took DC Thompson's to court. And he made an agreement with them, which de facto he won, but he wasn't allowed to talk about it. He had to sign an NDA in order to get whatever money he got from them. So I always had the feeling that onwards was upwards, in other words. So I thought, right, my generation has to be more militant than Leo's. It's a natural progression. And I think it's fair to say that myself, John Wagner, and Alan Grant, we're all pretty militant. And I assumed that your generation would be further militant. And I have to say that hasn't been the case. And probably too complex a reason to go into, but I think Thatcherism and Blairitism is a factor. And then I looked at other people from that previous generation. Don Lawrence, that I'm sure some of your, a lot will know.
Oh yeah, he's a genius.
Krigan Empire. Yeah. So he went to Europe, right? So I'm making a note of all these different people. So who's the nearest to John Wagner and myself? A guy called Tom Tully. And what he did was very, very different. He, very talented guy, easily, up there with the rest of us. But what he did was he decided to bang it out. So he made a lot of money in a very short space of time. And I remember him saying to me, there's no pension in this job. So I'm going to, this is why I'm going to do it this way. Yeah. So what he was producing was quality, but having produced it, he was thinning it out. And from a creative point of view, I'd say that I disapprove of that, and that's why I stopped using him on 2000 AD. But as a person, I admire him because he's thinking, how do I beat this appalling system? All right, I'm going to dilute because you don't deserve quality, because you're exploiting people, and that goes all the way through to the current people. But I thought, I do not want to end up like Tom Tully. That's a very long-winded way of saying that's this huge influence on me. So, you might, or other writers might say, well, do I want to use yourself or Alan Moore or whoever as a role model? And so the only role model I had was Tom Tully, and I thought, no, I do not want to dilute what I'm doing. So I've got to keep really on top of it. And then the other reason, which we can maybe come back to, is I think we're all of us driven by different things. On the face of it, initially, we're always all driven by, we've got a mortgage, we've got kids, and we've got to make things happen. And that, I think, masks all the much deeper reasons why we do what we do for a living.
Mm-hmm.
And so those reasons, in my case, I think meant that I couldn't do that cycle that you've pointed out, and which happens a lot. Mm-hmm. I'm quite familiar with that process happening in the States, where there's this guy who has this great name and reputation, and then maybe his stuff goes a bit off the boil and so on. Mm-hmm. So it's those two factors that keep me going.
No, it's funny. It's interesting you say that, because when I sold my company to Netflix about 6 years ago, and they bought my IP library. And I've always been Scottish, obviously quite radicalized, so for me, it was always very important to own the rights to everything I did. So I always had a plan, and the idea was that we would sell it, but I made sure the artist had a 50% stake in it with me. So when we sold the company, I didn't make 1 cent more than the artist. For me, it was always a real huge point of principle, that the companies got, like Marvel and Image and these companies that publish their stuff, they didn't see a cent from the company sale, because we owned everything 100%. And then the artist and I went,
good for you.
50-50.
It bears saying, because you guys never say it, and maybe because I worked up in Scotland, so perhaps I was looking at it as an outsider. Perhaps you just took it for granted. But Scotland is not just different in all the obvious ways. It's so different where comics are concerned.
We're like French farmers. We're like the French farmers,
Yeah, Scotland, from a comic point of view, might as well be Italy or France or Spain. The fact that it shares a border with England is completely irrelevant. Now, I'm sure there are other factors as well which might apply where Wales is concerned and Ireland. But I'm only really qualified to say that where Scotland is concerned. And it's why I love going up there, despite the weather. You know what I mean? Because it's a different, you have an affection for popular culture. Now, this sounds like people go, oh, what does that mean? It means a hell of a lot. You guys have an affection for popular culture, which the English, and this is a broad brushstroke here, don't have. So one of the first things when I worked for DC Thomson's in Scotland was they knocked that snobbery out of me. After making the tea and reading Annabelle and editing stories for My Weekly or whatever it was. All that kind of literati snobbery. That went very quickly.
Well, it's funny because I didn't really know middle-class people growing up, like as a working-class Scottish kid,
You have a different class system. It's there, but not in the same way.
But high culture and low culture is the same thing in Scotland. There's no snobbery at all about it. So I was reading comics at the same time as we're doing Shakespeare in school and everything. I just see it as all one thing, But it amazed me in England that kids were forbidden from reading American comic books or the kind of things you do, especially, the subversive comic books and everything,
they'd be ripped up.
I'd never heard of that.
Because greater accolade than it's years since I've heard this story, because obviously generations have passed, but to hear one of my comics got torn up by a teacher. Brilliant. Better than an Eisner Award.
But it's funny, I was so unaware of it until I came to England and people said to me, their idea of pop culture was Gormenghast, like Mervyn Peake or something. And I was like, what? That was their idea of something kind of frivolous and silly, And I feel like... you must be familiar with Ur Willie in Scotland, the DC Thomson stuff,
Yeah, very.
But Ur Willie at one point, I think it's not far off this now, but there's 6 million people in Scotland, 5.5 million people, but they sold 1 million copies of it every Christmas. Yeah. And that's like, they reckoned there was roughly one in every household.
And it's probably still the case today, or not far off. It's not far off.
Yeah.
And, every Scottish person I've met, or even ones with some kind of Scottish ancestry, they all mention Willie.
And of course, Beano Dandy and everything all coming out of Dundee, So it was quite interesting. But it's funny you say, though, the thing that really struck me is that idea where you said in terms of whenever we're writing, we don't know what drives us and whether it's cash or not. Like when we sold the company, I took 1 week off work and then went back to work the following week, and that's when you realise It's nothing to do with getting paid. As long as you can pay your bills, that's important, you know. But there's some weird thing. It's like being pregnant, isn't it? Being a writer, you have to keep getting these things out there.
You're getting there. That's the first thing when new writers would say to me, "Have you got any tips?" And the first thing I say to them is, "You've got to ask yourself, why do you want to write?" And if you think that the answer is because you've always dreamed of writing Batman or Judge Dredd or whatever, that's the wrong answer. And if you think it's because you're going to make a lot of money, and a few do, but a lot more don't, that's the wrong answer as well. You've got to find out what is driving you. And that's not really, whenever I'd say this to young writers, that really wasn't what they wanted to hear. It means you've got to go on a kind of internal journey, and you may not like what you discover, the reasons why you write. You can have a kind of superficial reason, you know. In other words, that would do. That's a good enough motive. But once you really start looking, it's a big thing.
And what is it with you? Because, you know, there's obviously themes in your work, you know, like I can see from looking at a 50-year plus career, you know, that you can see your themes and so on. But what is it that keeps you fresh and keeps you interested and gets you there? Like, what do you think it is in you?
Well, it's... I mean, it really is. We have a problem with vocabulary here, because anything that is remotely, I wouldn't even say psychological, more psychic or magical or anything, there aren't really words for it, because we live in a very scientific world where anything esoteric or strange is not really acknowledged, or the standard answer will be, there must be a scientific explanation for that, or whatever. But it's the muse. Now, the muse is well known in Greek mythology, and you know, it sounds like a flashy way of saying inspiration, but it's much, much deeper than that. And funnily enough, that's why I wrote my latest book, which I shall give a plug for because it explains it better than me, is Page Turners, which is about the search for the muse, the magic of the muse, examples of the muse, which, to explain them in scientific terms, would be impossible. I think one can settle for saying it's your source of inspiration. But that's because we live in this world where when one looks at the complexity of the muse, I mean, it drives artists, it drives carpenters, it drives anyone who's doing anything remotely creative. And it has its own agenda. And if you step away from whatever it is you're meant to do, the chances are the muse will sabotage you. So, for example, if I vague memories of occasionally dipping into things that, as you know, if you were to sum up my work generally, it always has an anti-establishment theme. But if there was something that was, what shall we say, a bit new agey or even establishment, the chances are it wouldn't work, or I wouldn't stay with it. In other words, I would leave. So it's almost like the muse intervenes and sabotages me. So if I was to say, I write a young children's book with what should we say, an endorsement of the status quo in some way, I don't know. I have no idea how to do it. But supposing that happened, and I did come close to it a few years ago. But, you know, something sort of like the Wombles or something, I would be sabotaged in some way. So you don't mess with the muse. What do you want me to do? Yep, I shall do that. And that's where I go.
People are afraid to say it, aren't they? But it is quite a spiritual job in that sense, because you know, in some level that's so deep within you, you can't see that something's working or it's not working, and there's no science to it. It's like, it's the same as a tune, isn't it? The notes in the right order are sometimes perfect, and it's the same with a story, and you know when it's not working too, don't you? When it's when it's leaving you too.
It is kind of spiritual, and that's I kind of envy some writers who, let's say, are driven by different muses, and I can only think really offhand of text writers in that respect, say P.G. Wodehouse, who wrote these wonderful Jeeves stories. So everything is quite light and frothy, and there's comedy and so on. And that's obviously what his muse wanted him to do, because he was writing it right up till the end of his life.
Yeah.
But I think my muse is a harsher mistress.
Was there ever a point where you considered being something else? Or was this always who you were going to be, you know, when you were 18 or whatever?
Yeah, always the plan, really. Yeah. As I say, I think what I was saying before it went down was I had my first story rejected by the BBC when I was 10.
Okay.
And I remember thinking to myself that there was an 8-year-old who just had a children's book published, and thinking, God, I got to hurry up. You know, she's already in print, and here am I, you know, still a wannabe writer, at age 10 or 11, whatever it was. Yeah. So yeah, it was a very strong ambition from very, very early on. Yeah.
And what was your life like at that time? What was your life like at that time? Like, where were you living? Like, who was in the house? All that kind of stuff.
Well, I don't know. How would one try to describe it well, I went to, I'm trying to think how to summarize this and stay on track. I went to an extremely good, or supposedly extremely good, college. Yeah. Which I left prematurely, and which, although it was a supposedly extremely good college, it was a Catholic college, De La Salle's, and it was what are we talking? Beginning of the 1960s, and let's put it like this. My mother was a widow, so therefore what that means, and I know this from my research on the subject, that you're at risk. You know, the abusers in the Catholic system, they only go for the 10% of the class who are vulnerable in some way. So if you've got a dad who's a fireman or something, they're far too cowardly to do anything. But if you haven't, they are going to come after you. So that was the kind of world that I was in, and which I kind of fought back very hard, which is why you know, there's no real issue for me in terms of a lot of people who went through that system, who are part of that 10%, would either be very badly affected by drugs or alcohol or mental illness of some description. But if you fight back, which is a process I'm still doing. I mean, I had the head of the De La Salle's with some help from another St. Joseph's old boy. We got him sacked. This is just 2 or 3 years ago. So
wow. Yeah,
I'm a vengeful character. That fighting. Well, it's not for me at my age. It's for the 14-year-old. You know what I mean? In other words, you couldn't get them at the time, so it's left to your older self to get this done. And I did it's an ongoing process, and it's not a process I feel uncomfortable about. And in its own way, it's a little more than cathartic. It's also a great source of material, as anyone who knows from the stuff I write. I mean, if you've, Nemesis, for example, Torquemada, that's all obviously inspired by my Catholic youth. And so yeah, it's great material. So I don't see it in terms of as being a negative, an entirely negative thing at all. I don't sort of think, oh God, if I hadn't gone to this school, or if those things hadn't happened, I'd have been whatever. I'll tell you why I would have been. I'd probably been a really boring history teacher. that would have been the other. You were asking me what else what I might have been, and probably history is probably the closest to it. So I'd have probably been a history teacher, or even worse, an establishment writer.
Yeah.
So every cloud, yeah.
But I mean, I guess that's your anti-authoritarianism is in there from year 10 then, isn't it? You know, a sense of justice and being suspicious of the establishment. You know?
Absolutely. And there were a lot of insights into it that fall outside the normal circumstance for someone, you know, maybe just, you know, goes to christenings, weddings, and, you know, church on Sunday, and that's all fine and good luck to them. But my experience was actually very different, and in a certain sense, colourful, and in a frustrating sense, why can't I remember more? Because you know, we're talking. The phrase I use, and it's quite deliberate. I was indentured into the church. In other words, you know, I was church property in a way that your average Catholic perhaps isn't. So I was kind of indentured, and that gave me an insight into all sorts of things that I've used in stories. But frustratingly, I can only remember bits of them. I'm thinking, damn, if I could remember more. I mean, you know this as well as I do, that if you haven't experienced life in some form or another, it's going to show in your writing, because you can't get it all out of Wikipedia. You know, you've got to live it. You've got to have something to write about. And you know, if you talk, for example, about, let's say, particularly mean characters or villains, you've got to have. Okay, you might magnify it, but or perhaps not in my case. But you've got to have something to draw on. You can't write about. I think one of my strongest fortes probably is the villains.
Yes, you do.
My villains are particularly memorable, and that's because you know, I'm drawing on real life, and some of them are, you know, quite interesting to deal with, and so. Yeah, you've got to draw on real life. So if you like, I think it might even be fair to say that I probably got the kind of, perhaps other writers might experience a lot of life in their 20s. By the time I was in my 20s, I was busy writing fairly awful comic strips for IPC with some help from John Wagner. So it's fair to say I probably got all those kind of life experiences out of the way quite early on. So it's a little out of the normal order.
I guess maybe all writers, in some sense, they have to create a parallel reality because they're not enjoying the one they're currently in, aren't they? You know, that the most avid readers are the people who are not having a good time at school or whatever. You know, like people they have to go somewhere else, and that can be a positive thing as well, can't it? You know, like
absolutely.
But I think every writer I know has a secret origin like that of some kind, don't they? You know, for me, it was my parents' time when I was a kid. So then I think I then, you know, got obsessed with superhero comics and everything, and that just became my little escape from things. But every writer has got something like that, I think.
Everyone's and I think you possibly do the same thing as me. If you're watching a film, it's to spot the writer. Who's the writer in it? Often it's fairly obvious, you know, that there'll be this newspaper reporter who's clearly a version of the writer, you know, and they're nearly always heroic figures, aren't they? They're never shit.
Well, we are. You know. So I mean, that path then, like from school, I mean, did you go to a boarding school or was it
I was a day boy.
A day boy. And,
that was always my my mantra. As to why I didn't unlock Pandora's box until, well, probably in my 40s. Because I'd always say, you know, I was a day boy, so it wasn't as bad for me as it was for the not true. But that was my way of protecting myself from these awful memories. And then because the assumption is that if you're a boarder, you've got nowhere to run.
That's what I would have thought,
That's the assumption. And that's one that I use to, as I say, to keep Pandora's box really locked. Mm-hmm. And then progressively, I realized as these kind of memories started surging back, that actually it's the other way around, because if you go to a school where there are a lot of predators, and that often happens in boarding schools and particularly Catholic boarding schools, if you're a day boy, there are other locations, whereas the locations for a predator as a boarder are limited literally to let's say what it would be a cubicle at the end of a dormitory. So the monk has this kind of cubicle at the end, and he roams the dormitory, and awful things happen, and et cetera, et cetera. But apart from the headmaster, who's also got his office and did use it in that way, geography is quite limited. Whereas for a day boy, the geography is unlimited, and so that was quite a scary place to be.
Really?
And but scary, but at the same time, if you're familiar with it your entire life, and you've been fighting these people your entire life, I'm not even sure it leaves you marked. I mean, everything, bereavement you're mentioning and so on, everything leaves its mark, but I'm not sure it left such a mark that it knocked me for six. Maybe for limited periods of time, and then you pick yourself up and say, right, well, I've got to fight back. And
when did that begin for you?
Part of your journey.
When did the fight back begin for you? Like this?
Ah, right. Well, let me think. Well, I suppose really the fight back starts to emerge in my stories, where to begin with, I had no idea that all my stories were going to be anti-establishment, and an awful lot of them. I mean, bear in mind, just to set the scene here, I was working on girls' comics, boys' comics, and what are laughingly called fun comics. And I think over a period of time, I started to realize that the stories I liked to write and the ones that editors were getting me to write were stories with a strong element of subversion that didn't apply to other editors and other comics. So no one's going to approach me to write Roy the Rovers, say, because that's a relatively establishment story. He's a straight guy, works for Melchester Rovers or whatever they're called. And, there's no challenge to society there. But I would be writing girls' comics like School for Snobs. I would be writing stories about conceived by Jerry Finley Day, the Rogue Trooper co-creator. Aunt Aggie, who was a kind of female Jimmy Savile. And then another one, Sugar Jones, which again was a kind of Jimmy Savile-like figure. And it took a while for it to, because all the time you're thinking, well, I've got to make a living at this. And there's the ghost of Tom Tully in the back of my mind. How does he do it? He does it by knocking it out. My God, I want to get the outside of the house painted. So I've got to do a Tom Tully. I think I use phrases like that. I've got to do a Tom Tully and knock something out. And then after a while, I thought, my God, the stories I actually enjoy doing are the ones that are anti-establishment, and the ones that are quote unquote straight. I'm unable to write. I have great trouble with. I'll give you an example, one that John Wagner and I struggled over. I'd previously written a story which was used. I think it was the first thing I submitted to Girls Comics. it wasn't called Anne of 1,000 Tears, but it was something like that. So, you're in for a really happy story. And it was about the Irish potato famine. So obviously with my Irish background, it was something that really resonated with me. And their only criticism of it was, which is absolutely valid, was it's a bit one note. It's down, down, down. You need to create some ups as well as some downs.
Yeah.
So that came very naturally to me. It's an anti-establishment story, very valid. The sinister role of the British occupying force and so forth. And it was really resonating with me. And by comparison, John and I, we were told to write another story, which we were, at that time at least, totally unqualified to write. It was called Anne's Animal Sanctuary. And we sat there heavily smoking, thinking, what are we going to do, John? And I don't know. It took us a week, and I think eventually we gave up. I don't think we could string half a dozen sentences together, which for John and I is astonishing, because normally the ideas would be spilling over us. And whereas now I could, because I actually know an animal sanctuary here in Spain, and I know the emotions and but that's not just about, what should we say, being a bit more mature. It's also because an animal sanctuary doesn't actually have an anti-establishment angle in it. Although if I was going to write it, I'd be desperately looking for it. The Spanish authorities, are they trying to shut it down? That would do me, So this went on for some time. And I think, as I ended up actually creating comics, then it becomes really obvious. So, for instance, on Battle Picture Weekly, which I started with John Wagner, I had a rule which I was really quite insistent upon, and I still bristle to this day when I find the odd exception to it. That then we can't have officers as heroes. That just came out of nowhere. They've always got to be NCOs or ordinary soldiers. We cannot have an officer as a hero. And it never really occurred to me to think, what's all that about? But, it's obviously to do with your school background and all the rest of it, and probably a lot else. So I think that's when the awareness began. And then it went from there to action comic, which your American readers, viewers may not be aware of, but it was a very controversial, very street level comic, which eventually got banned because it, quote unquote, went too far.
Did it actually get banned? Because I'd always heard the rumor it got banned. Did it actually get?
Yeah.
Because it was selling well, wasn't it? I mean, yeah. What happened?
It was, they gave me 6 weeks to create action. It's like, what? My God, 6 weeks to create a comic. That's just insane. So it was all done in a hurry. And the idea really, what I wanted to do, I wanted to keep my independence. I did not want to become a staff member. So I was happy to create a comic and then move on to the next one and so forth. And so in the case of Action, I passed it over after we had a successful launch and it worked. And the reader feedback was really looking for, they wanted it to be hard and gritty, and we didn't know the boundaries of how far and how gritty we could go. And so it was a learning curve for all of us, and we learned the hard way. And the reason it got so much press attention and got banned really was because the circulations were really high. You're talking, what would it be as a guess? I don't know, 140,000 a week, something like that.
My God, I mean, that's good in the whole of America, never mind a small country like the UK, which is only 20% the size, Yeah. And it was also competing with a lot of books that were doing over 100,000 as well, so.
Oh, yeah. Comics were selling incredibly well. Now, okay, there's a lot more competition today, but even so, there is still and we talked about this earlier, that there's still that hankering for comics in one form or another, because it's a different medium. I mean, it's like there's no real reason why it should die out. You've just got to move with the times and change with the times. And but anyway, I moved on from action, and it spiraled. It went too far, and it's a long story, but anyway, they banned it, and but brought it back in a castrated form, and it even survived, I think, in a castrated form for maybe another 6 months or so before it got merged into Battle or something like that happened. Yeah.
And then, like, it's funny to think, because now you just hear of comics getting cancelled. It's amazing to hear of IPC coming to you and saying, can you do this for me? Can you create a new boys comic and so on? So 2000 AD, did you have to go to them, or did they say to you, we're looking for a sci-fi boys comic, or did you have a proposal for this?
Well, I think it was like I'd done Battle with John Wagner.
Yeah.
I did Action solo, and I wanted to do something else. And one guy, Kelvin Gosnell, had said he thought that the next coming thing was science fiction.
And this is a good year before Star Wars then? Yeah, like a while before.
Yeah, easily. Probably more than a year before Star Wars. So all we had to go on were things like Logan's Run, Damnation Alley, and so on, which were a bit, and you see, it was almost like the parade had gone by, because Thunderbirds and all those kind of things had been and gone, and they were, if you like, they weren't cutting it at that point in time. The nostalgia audience hadn't cut in, and there was something ephemeral about them. So Kelvin put up a good case for saying there should be a science fiction comic, and science fiction was really disapproved of at that time. Kids really wanted reality, and comics had a bad reputation for finding easy ways out of problems, either through using magic or science fiction, rather than the hero being proactive. And so that was, I was quite nervous about it in that respect. And so anyway, I put the proposal to the publisher, and he said, obviously, because I'd done Battle and Action, that he'd like me to do it. And I spent a year doing it. And what I discovered was, I previously thought, well, if I talk stories over with writers, they can go away and write the stories that I've come up with, or the kind of stories that I think that they would be good at. But I found that process was just too laborious. It's actually simpler to just sit down and write them yourself, because that way you haven't got to keep arguing and saying, no, I don't like that ending, and don't like the title, and all this kind of stuff. So it's just quicker, just get on with it yourself. So I spent a year, just wrote the whole thing. And so that was the process, and it worked. And 2000 AD sold even better than Action. It sold initially slightly north of literally 200,000 copies a week.
And what was your launchpad? There was no television advertising, wasn't there? Because
there was, yeah. And I can still remember talking to the PR people, and they were showing me this advert where I think Tharg comes down from a spaceship or something. No, it goes up in Kingsreach Tower, this building which is actually a spaceship, something of that sort. And it looked really good. And I always remember saying, what about, so it was in color, obviously. And I said, well, what's it look like in black and white, for kids who've got black and white? And the PR guy said, only a very small percentage of the population have black and white TVs these days. I thought, well, I'm one of them. But so it did have a television launch, and we had all sorts of things in it to create a certain controversy and to create a certain appeal. So we brought back Dan Dare, and There was a story featuring a Russian invasion of Britain, which, went through a long period of seeming ridiculous. And these days, well, if it was revived tomorrow, I think there would be many who might feel, well, that was a good idea, and so forth. It went down very well, and then I moved on to do a girls' comic, Misty. Because it had, but everything by all the 2000 AD stories, I can't think of any real exception. They all had an anti-establishment feeling in one way or another. Some things that we take for granted today, and we say, well, what's the big deal about that? So back in action, I had a black hero, black boxer, written by John Wagner, and the managing editor said, "You can't have a black boxer. Yeah. Why don't you have a white boxer with a black sidekick?" Now, even in whatever it was, 1976. Yeah. Even in 1976, it still makes me cringe just thinking about it now. How can you think like that? But they did. They really did, and
we take everything for granted now, don't we? I guess like Peter Cook in the early 60s when he's mocking Harold Macmillan, like people were writing letters to the BBC and aghast, and then that's just Friday night television, isn't it? People mock the Prime Minister in every comedy show now, but we take it for granted, but we forget there was the first guy who had to win that argument to go and do that thing,
Yeah. There was so many firsts that we did that now it would be so what? Like we had a German hero. Now the idea of, the Germans are always seen, as the bad guys, very much how our media portray the Russians in that respect. So back then, the Germans were still seen as the memory from World War II was still there. And I think, all us baby boomers thought, well, that was then. This is now. What about showing the more positive side of the conflict, of German soldiers who did their duty, etc., etc. So that's where we were.
Hey, you lucky devils! Just to let you know, we've got 5 new comics out this year from Dark Horse Comics. Nemesis Rogues Gallery is out in July. Prodigy 3 is out in August. Nightclub 2 also out in August. The Magic Order's big finale, Volume 5, is out in September, and the Jupiter's Legacy finale is finally here in October. Also out from Dark Horse this year, we have the Wanted and Big Game hardcover, a huge library edition, and the Ambassadors with all your favourite artists collected into one big beautiful hardcover in November. Don't miss it. But it wrote, sometimes the stars align, don't they? And it's like somebody like you and John being there at the same time Star Wars is coming out and off the back of Punk. Just like it couldn't have been cooler, wasn't it? Like all these other comics are kind of beloved, like Action in particular. People have a really amazing folk memory of now, don't they? That even though it didn't last a long time, people really loved it. But 2000 AD it just became part of the zeitgeist for such a long time, didn't it? Like, if you picked up any music magazine, they would just drop references to 2000 AD like everybody knew what it was, which is unthinkable now for a comic book, isn't it? It was so in the culture.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, it was. We were in the right place at the right time, I think. Yeah. And there were so many talented individuals who all were somehow there. Now,
what's your theory about that? I mean, that's weird.
Where are all those talented? Where's the latest? Of course, they've gone to computer games or Netflix or whatever, But they're not coming into comics. There's probably a few, but nowhere near the number where you had Brenda McCarthy from, with the whole Mad Max background now, and Brian Bolland and Carlos Esquerra and Mick McMahon.
It's insane. I mean, that lineup of guys who are all about the same age. But you'll be familiar with Malcolm Gladwell, the Outliers book. Have you read Outliers?
I haven't, no.
It's a really interesting book, and it actually explains this, and it basically talks about sort of Steve Jobs, Bill Gates, all these guys, all born at exactly the right time, all within sometimes a year or two of each other, and all the guys who make a massive difference in whatever industry they go into tend to be born around the same time. And then they all get the same opportunity at the same time, like a cheap home computer becoming available to them when they're at that age and so on, So I think like you, John, Alan Grant, so on, all these guys who are all broadly the same age, must have had the same influences at exactly the right time, and then the opportunities arose for you guys at the same time. But it was a golden age of creators, wasn't it? I mean, it was really amazing.
Astonishing, yeah. And it was very exciting. And there was a very human element to it, which was we'd all be falling out with each other some of the time, but there was a lot of intensity, there was a lot of passion. Yeah. And I think in more recent years, that's noticeably lacking, or at least
oh my God, are you kidding?
Experience of it.
You mean the falling out happens? The falling out happens still,
Well, the falling out will always happen. But what I mean to say is, like, it's that human interaction. And I'll pick a very neutral example. I can think of at least one computer-orientated company where I went to visit them, and it was like a mausoleum. Yeah. I mean, everyone's sitting at their desk and they're all working away, and it's all dead silent. Well, they've got their earphones in, they're listening to music, but there wasn't the color. And I think probably for my generation, there was a slight sense of having the parade had already gone by, because Fleet Street with all those drunken lunches and all that. We had the last hurrah from that, if you like. And I can remember, maybe 2 or 3 years of that. And of course, that's what we all feel. We all think, oh God, it must have been great, that previous generation. Yeah. And so you want to sort of almost recreate it. But there was a lot of colorful characters. Yeah. There was a lot of alcoholism. A lot of people got really hammered, and yet they still produced very creative work. So it's kind of almost classic Fleet Street, if you like, filtered down to us working in juveniles.
It's funny because, like, I've always said you're the most interesting man in comics and everything, and for me it was like there was legends about you because we didn't really know you, like you sort of did your own thing. Everybody else was kind of wanting to work in America where you were wanting to go to Europe, so you didn't sort of become part of that scene where everybody would be, at dinners with Jeanette Kahn and Karen Berger and everybody. You always had your eye on France, which I always found really, really interesting. So you always played your own field. And I think you're such a natural contrarian. And I mean that as a compliment. I think when you see things going that way, you think, well, wouldn't it be more interesting to try this and go and do that, So I'd always hear legends about you, although I didn't hang out with you or anything. But I remember hearing, for example, that you were in a cult in France and you had 12 wives or something like this. And I remember I heard this back in the 90s and I was like, bloody hell, And this was the buzz around the British comic scene for a while. They said, Pat Mills is living in France in the commune now and he's a white witch or something like that, What's the story behind all that? Because I think there's a seed of truth in there, isn't there?
Absolutely, yeah. And in fact, you probably missed a bit of it because there was some... Well, just to set the whole scene, it wasn't me at all. It was my writing partner, Tony. Right. And we wrote Accident Man together, and we wrote Finn and Punisher 2099, which, your American audience hopefully have positive memories of, and particularly the detailed weaponry that we had in Punisher, which was all down to Tony. And so Tony... was and is what could be described as a cult leader, if you like, and he's part of he's a pagan, and so there's what is described as a witches' coven, and I think there's 13 of them in it, and it's a predominantly female coven, and so sometimes he would come over and work at my house in the UK, and other times I would go over to France. Yeah. And And so all this stuff is going on around you, and it's interesting and a bit more than interesting because slaying the horn god, a lot of that derives directly from the paganism that I was witnessing and the matriarchal elements and so forth. And this is long before the kind of modern version of paganism and so forth. And so that I think is one of the reasons why the horn god, from a story point of view, is so strong and so effective, because it's actually talking about genuine matriarchy, which now I think you must have missed it because so the parade had gone by for you, I'm afraid. Maybe you must have come in maybe in the mid-90s or something. So anyway, there's a period just a couple of years before where I relate this in my book, The Secret History of 2000 AD and Judge Dredd, where without trying to be cool about it or anything, but there was a kind of rock and roll atmosphere at the time. But it can't be calculated. It certainly can't be led by music magazines. They can get stuffed, the NME onwards. They are trying to sort of muscle in on 2000 AD. And part of it was that Tony and the ladies in the coven had a quite, what should we say, exotic lifestyle, which actually worked. And I think that's always a bit of a paradox, because everyone thinks, no, that'll never last. That's all rubbish. And so it worked. They're still in some of the longest term relationships I can think of.
Oh, the same people? I assumed there was a new way of
there's a certain turnover. As you can imagine, you've got 13 people, some of them are going to go on to form different setups and so on. Yeah. But essentially the founder members are, the what you might call the inner circle are still very much in place. And so they will come over for various comic conventions. This is why I say you must have missed this. And I would, let's say, I would do what would it have been, a book signing for Finn, the comic book edition. And so Tony would come along to that, and he would bring some members of his coven, and their background is literally rock and roll because they're musicians. That's one of the binding things. Comics was just a side thing for him, and we'd be working on comics all day, and then he'd say, right, I've got to go and record now. So he'd spend the evening in a recording studio. So anyway, some of the signings were a little outrageous. I think they were trying to embarrass me, and I think they came close. I really tried to resist it. They would say, do you want to sign this or that part of my body and all this kind of stuff in front of these rather horrified, or horrified, that's just the wrong word, startled hue of younger. So they were quite flamboyant. I think they just did it for fun, but there was a lot of disapproval towards them. And I, even to this day, I'm quite defensive of them, because they would, Steve McManus is memorably on record as saying, I can't have a witch working for 2000 AD. So you're thinking, okay, so we have to sort of, do new authors have to submit a CV of, that they're Church of England or fine upstanding in binary relationships and so forth. There was disapproval, and there was disapproval from my peers. They didn't like it. They were too exotic. Right. And my attitude to it really was, well, we had fun writing, and they're happy people, and what's wrong with that? And but I think if you've, I don't know, maybe maybe the people in question just had rather sheltered lives or something, you know. And whereas to me, it's just like, so what? The more they try and embarrass me, the more I would try not to. But I know I was blushing. I'm crossing myself over.
But it's interesting you were drawn to the spiritual aspects of it, though, you know, because I'd imagine the Catholicism became not a big thing for you, you know, by your teens and so on. You know, you maybe turned your back on that. But these things tend to manifest still in people in different ways, don't they? You know, so I'm always fascinated by, like, certainly over the last 50 years, as religion has become less of a thing in the West, new types of religion have manifested, you know, whether it's New Age religions or even climate change is a form of religion really within itself, isn't it? You know, the climate change activism, you know, we have our martyrs, we have our patron saints, you know, the martyrs are the Just Stop Oil guys, the patron saints is Greta Thunberg and so on. You know, it's an end of the world cult in a sense as well, isn't it? You know, so these things have a weird way of like leaving you in childhood but coming back in a new form, don't they? And I wonder, is that what that was for you? You know, was it some kind of spiritual replacement? Yeah,
absolutely. Because I think I'd rejected Catholicism and it had rejected me as well. So round about the age of 15, although maybe closer to 16 by the time I managed to get away from them all. But I mean, I'd been lined up for a seminary because it was put to me, well, if you have a vocation, you get a free education.
Yes.
And I suppose everyone has a sort of spirituality about them at the age of 11 or 12, but you're not really in a position to judge, I don't think. And then somewhere around about the age of 13 or 14, you discover girls and you think, well, wait a minute, how does this fit in with celibacy and everything? So one way or another, but I was lined up for the seminary, and they thought the relevance of this is, I suppose, that they thought that to remove me from temptation, or I'm trying to recreate what they must have said. They had me lined up for a junior seminary, which theoretically didn't exist, but they do, from the age of 15 onwards. And I visited this place, and it was like Lord of the Flies. So if you're, if you're 14 going on 15, and you've got these 18-year-old seminarians, you know, you think, oh my God, there's no way So officially, I discovered girls at the age of 13 or 14, and that was why I kind of parted company. But actually, it was seeing the seminary. And so they said, right, well, if you haven't got a vocation, we're going to stop paying your school fees. And so you're out on your ear. And so there was a great deal of pressure to conform, to agree to, in other words, you know, because for them it's a trophy. It's like, I don't know, in some cultures, you know, if your son's a doctor or a lawyer, but in Catholic culture, and certainly Irish Catholic culture, if your son's a priest, it's like, wow, that's a
that was me as well. Like my mum, I was an altar boy for years, and my mum prayed for me to become a priest. She prayed for me to become a priest, and I'm the youngest of 6, so she failed with every other one getting them to become a priest, and she was holding out for me, you know. But like, but yeah, it was not to be. Comics.
I remember reading. Was it you wrote and drew Savior? Was that?
That was the very first thing I ever did when I was like,
it's very good. And I remember thinking, good Catholic boy here. I recognize the vibe. So they kicked me out. But so that was the end, if you like, of that Catholic experience. And so obviously you look for other forms of spirituality, and I think paganism had appealed to me, and that's how I got to meet up with Tony, and we discovered we were kindred spirits, and he would talk to me about some of his belief systems, which I would put in Slain. And I said to him, look, you know, I can't keep writing this down. You've got to come and join me as a writer. And he said, I can't write to save my life. And I said, yes, you can. You know, all you got to do is just go for it, because you're you have all this knowledge and interest, and he actually likes popular culture a little bit more than me. He will sit through the, Fast and Furious 6 or whatever it is, and I'll be falling asleep. I can't face this. But no, he loves popular culture. So in some ways, coming back to what you're saying, it's like all these things are almost meant to be. There's a kind of, and I think that's how I see the muse. Yeah. That's how it is. It's a force that, society doesn't really allow for it. But I mean, I have some things in Page Turners, for instance, that really challenge the laws of coincidence. I think it was Arthur Kurtzler wrote a book on coincidence and its reality as a force. We all know it exists. I mean, you were doubtless familiar with the, as all authors are, with what's sometimes called the library angel, which is another form of the muse. So say, for example, you're deciding, right, you're going to write your next comic book or your next film project on Uruguay. I'm deliberately picking something obscure. There's a very good chance that the next time you go to a bar or a restaurant, you'll meet someone from Uruguay. It's that uncanny coincidence.
I'll tell you the weirdest thing, right? I'm sure you've heard this, but John Wagner years ago bought a house, I think it was in Ealing or something, and the guy who owned the house, right, and bear in mind there's 2 million, 3 million houses in London, the guy who owned the house back in the 50s was the man who started the Eagle comic,
Really?
I mean, A Million to One. The house I'm living in just now, the very first story I sold to 2000 AD, there was a guy from the House of Lords called Sir Edward Bulwer-Lytton, right? And he was the guy who coined the phrase, the pen is mightier than the sword, and it was a dark and stormy night, He wrote the world's first ever superhero story, which I didn't know, right? He wrote it in 1840. It was a thing called The Coming Race. And Hitler was a massive fan.
I know that. I've heard that one. Yeah.
It's kind of like the X-Men.
Nazi-like quality or something, didn't it?
The Fuel Society.
Vril, yeah.
Vril, yeah. The Fuel Society, worshipped his stuff, and Hitler was a massive fan of him. The house I'm living in now is his house, right? And I didn't know this until I bought it. I bought the house, but he was the guy who was in the first story I ever sold. He was the main character in the first story I ever sold by billion to one chance, and he wrote the first ever superhero story. So writing brings its own odd coincidences, doesn't it?
I think those coincidences you've described, I think they certainly rival some of the ones I mentioned in Page Turners. That are equally weird in different ways. But I mean, that's quite astonishing. The Bulwer-Lytton thing is particularly the case. I mean, that's where Bovril came from, actually.
That's right. The Latin beef in Vril Society,
but that's astonishing. I mean, and none of us, to my knowledge, because we must all do this, I certainly do it. We must, or maybe Grant Morrison has done it, someone must have done it, done a story on coincidence. In other words, what are the roots of coincidence? What are the conclusions about it? It would be great if someone did, because I'd rather, wading through the roots of coincidence by Arthur Kurtzler is not as good. There's a drama in it. There is a drama in that whole thing of, those impossible synchronicity. It's so strange. And I'm sure it affects us all. We all of us have these odd experiences, and which are closer to esoteric than anything else.
Well, do you not think it's a sign maybe you're on the right track, maybe, or something? These little coincidences are just little touchstones, aren't they? Like my next door neighbor, weirdly, here's another odd one. My next door neighbor, he's a Nobel Prize winning geologist, and he found out that the house 200 years ago was a world famous geologist who owned the house. His wife is the same name as this guy's wife. And he adopted a kid that was his sister's kid when his sister died at a specific age. And the same thing happened exactly 200 years before in the house. It's like The Shining. It's absolutely crazy. So life's full of these odd little things, though, isn't it? Yeah.
Definitely. All the time. And it's, Yeah, I think that's a good explanation. It's an encouragement to say you're on the right track.
Yeah. But I have to, the thing that I always think of with you more than anyone else is politics, like you're probably the most political writer there's ever been in comics, I think. I mean, it's embedded in the DNA of everything, none more so than Crisis, which was, again, another very zeitgeist comic and everything, Where are you now politically? Because people change over time. I mean, guys often drift towards the right, which I don't imagine you've done, as they get older, I'd imagine you're more radicalized than ever, But then the political spectrum has changed so much in the last 30 years. Like, who would have guessed? The president right now, Joe Biden, has voted for every war that he could possibly vote for, ever since he's been. The Democrats were taken over by the military-industrial complex, and they're as bad as the Republicans now.
And the conspiracy theorists are just as likely, in fact, more likely to come from the right now than from the left.
Oh, I would say more so now.
I mean, certainly the ones I meet, I realize that they're politically, they are right-wing, but they believe in all sorts of, in my view, sort of conspiracy views, on things. I'm worse than ever. I deliberately, I stay away from conspiracy views, not because I don't believe that some of them may well be true, but because it's not going to reach an audience, because anything that people can say, oh, that's just conspiracy theory, it can be dismissed. And I only really have two areas of expertise. The rest, I know as much as the man in the pub, and probably a little bit less than the man in the pub. So, it's no good, as it were, having a particular perspective on, say, Ukraine or the Middle East. I know as much or as little as anybody else. But the areas where I really do have a certain expertise would be on World War I, because I wrote Charlie's War, and the Catholic Church. That's the other one. But from a political perspective, with World War I really thought at the time, after completing Charlie's War, I thought, well, that's the end of that, move on to something else and so on. And then as we got towards the end of the 90s and we got into the millennium, at first it seemed like paranoia that historians were rewriting history. And they were basically saying Haig was a good guy, and this wasn't a mistake, this wasn't a tragedy. I discovered all sorts of stuff about World War I, and I really felt I had to carry on where Charlie's War left off. And so I'm writing this story which starts on my Substack site. It's one of my particular ways of, there's so many things that make independent writing and publishing valid, which we haven't gone into, but I think we probably all know about Amazon print on demand.
I think the last thing I asked you was, as the political spectrum is tilted 90 degrees or whatever, and we've now got Democrats voting for war and all this kind of stuff, where are you now? Like where are you politically? Because I see you as the John Pilger of comics. I see you as a very principled leftist kind of guy and everything, But is there anyone you've got faith in at the moment?
No. John Pilger is definitely one of my heroes, and sad to hear of his passing just a few weeks ago. What I found is that it's only really World War I that I have any actual expertise on or any great insight on. Where everything else is concerned, there's for one side against the other side and so forth. Now, World War I may seem like, well, what does it matter what happened 100 years ago or more? But in fact, it's still very relevant for today. I mean, the Middle East was designed by France and Britain after World War I. So, we're all of us today experiencing the aftermath of the Great War. And I discovered that it was actually really important. Ultimately, because of the centenary year, centenary years, 2014 to 2018, where I discovered, to my astonishment and alarm, that anything that was anti-war was just not on our screen. So, never mind conspiracy theories, it's provable. So the best example would be Blackadder Goes Forth, which is wonderfully funny, and also its ending is very moving. And that was not shown in any major way during the centenary years. It's probably on something like Dave or something like that, perhaps, maybe. But and there's many other examples. And the one that really did it for me was at the British Library, there was this, what was it, called something like Comics Unmasked. And it was like, well, we're really going to show what comics are really all about, and what the Brits are doing. So that would have been that would have been 2014. And so they had a fair amount of my stuff there, and lots of other people's stuff. But the most important one, especially in the centenary year, was Charlie's War. And I said, why isn't it here? And I got nervous answers. And I thought, my God, if ever there is an example of censorship. So if you look at the way World War I is talked about, it's the poppy has become arguably rather more militarized than it used to be. Much more a sign of patriotism rather than a remembrance alone. So I really felt I had to carry on in that direction. And so I am with various projects, but one in particular is about what some of the things I didn't know enough about when I was writing Charlie's War. For instance, soldiers sent over the top taking cocaine from the Wellcome Foundation Force March. So it would be with their rum ration, rum and coke, literally. And so there's all those things and much else. So I'm now writing about this subject on Substack, which, then when I've produced enough of the material, I'll bring it out as a novel. But there's so many aspects. And what I was saying in particular was that so much stuff can easily be dismissed as conspiracy theory. That's just your opinion or whatever. Even the great John Pilger, so much of what he said, I couldn't bring myself to see whatever the Guardian had to say, because they certainly kind of had very little to do with him in later years. So in this novel, MI7 Assassin, MI7 is, you've got MI5, MI6, but MI7 was propaganda. Now, propaganda was in some ways worse than what they were doing in MI5 and MI6. And it's quite a fascinating story. But what I do is I use actual quotes from people who are saying this, so it's beyond any reasonable doubt. Because otherwise, what we all tend to do these days is we say, it's fake news. It's conspiracy theory. It doesn't really count. So that's the kind of angle that I go for. And that's probably the only area where I feel I have any insight, knowledge, authority. And elsewhere, I have similar views that reflect that negativity to the way World War I was reported. But I wouldn't say that I have absolute authority. And I've visited a number of the sort of countries involved in recent conflicts, but it could still be said, that's anecdotal. But it's actually quite useful to talk to people. And got a fair number of friends in Eastern Europe, and that balkanization is depressing. You know how it works, and I said to one friend of mine who is Bosnian but originally came from Montenegro. I said, well, at least Montenegro can't be, it's got to be different to all the others where they're all pulling apart. He said, no, the northern Montenegrins aren't fond of the south ones because the northern ones are mountain people. And, you know, somehow in Britain, we've, relatively speaking, and, you know, Scotland, Scots and Welsh may feel differently, but within the UK, within England at least, there isn't that balkanization that...
That's true.
And it's kind of scary because it's once you start that process, it's where do you stop?
Well, it's interesting, isn't it? Because we always assume history is a straight line of progress and it's onwards and upwards, and you realize it's all cyclical. So I really felt it. I spent a lot of time last year in Croatia, and the thing that surprised me was just this place that was so beautiful, so recently was in ruins, you know, and then so recently before that was beautiful. You know, how quickly society can completely collapse, you know, and everything we take for granted can go, you know, and that's why I'm always terrified as you see the war drums going and everything, and you think we won't fall for it again, but we do every time, don't we? You know, like the general public fall for what's being pushed at them each time, and the guys in the background are the same guys making all the cash from this stuff. It's a very... Well,
that's why I was so fascinated with propaganda. And I realized that, to the best of my knowledge, it's a subject that hasn't been covered, at least in comics, and possibly outside it. It's something people say, oh, that's just propaganda or whatever. But the mechanics of how it works are really quite scary and quite repetitive. Like you were citing the example of Croatia and how things... a cycle repeats. Well, it's the same. If you saw the headlines of in World War I, it would be about I don't know about babies being beheaded, but certainly babies being bayoneted.
Yes,
a not dissimilar thing, and all the kind of atrocities that are quoted, whether it's in the Ukraine or the Middle East, they would find their equivalent in World War I, and there would sometimes be an element of truth. But invariably, certainly in Britain, they were exaggerated to the point where you could only say this was fake news or this is a lie. Yeah. And some of them are extraordinary. But the most extraordinary thing about it all is that the people who made up MI7, which is why I became so fascinated by it, are all the famous writers of the day. So you name them, they were all either in MI7 or they were working for MI7. So H.G. Wells, Conan Doyle, and it was all secret. So they had kind of, there was this meeting before when war broke out, and it's like, we want you to work for us, but we don't want you, you know, that you are actually government backed. Yeah. And the story of what they got up to is just astonishing.
That's amazing, and I've never heard this. I mean, I'd love you to do this as a story. I'd love to read that. Yeah.
Well, I'm. What am I up to at the moment? I have my story all planned, and you've probably had the same thing, where you realize, actually, I've got to write the origins first. Yeah. You know what I mean? You've got your main story, which is set on a train, and as you know, murders on a train. I wouldn't say it's a breeze, but it's a lot easier than just about anywhere else, right? You think, hey, murderers on a train, I can relax and enjoy myself on this, you know? And especially as it was an Orient Express that was being used in World War I. And then I realized, my God, I've got to write the origins of this guy. Yeah. So I wrote one origins, what I thought was a short story, and ended up being at least 5,000 words. And then I wrote so I'm now on my fourth origin story in Substack. And it's covering all the, probably the most astonishing one is Britain and Germany selling arms to each other in the course of World War I. You're thinking, wait a minute, you can't do that. I mean, if you had Russia and Ukraine selling war products to each other, you would say, well, what's going on here? And the same thing was happening between France and Germany and between Britain and Germany. And they were all heavily involved with one another, and their excuses are so transparently thin, like, well, we've got to think about after the war, so we have to keep these industries going. You're thinking, wait a minute, you're trying to kill each other. So, yeah, I find the whole subject of propaganda fascinating, not least because many of the authors who are my heroes when I was growing up, you know, H. Rider Haggard, Conan Doyle, and so on, were all part of this propaganda machine, which obviously thought was their patriotic duty, just as I suspect that the majority of writers, if they were asked today, you know, if there was a particular conflict that Britain was directly involved in, you've got to do, or the United States, you know, you've got to do your patriotic duty and say that so-and-so are the bad guys. And what normally goes with that is that the country they're up against is usually ruled by a madman. That's that's essential. You know, they've always got to be a madman of some kind. And they always commit atrocities. And Britain and America never commit atrocities, apart from the ones that we now know about.
Well, the victors write history as well. You know, my dad was in World War II. He was in the sort of tail end of World War II. And he said to me he would read things in the newspapers he knew weren't true. You know, and I'd been a conspiracy guy my entire life because that's just the way I was raised. My dad was a trade union guy, never trusted the establishment or anything. But he said he saw it with his own eyes, you know, things where people were being lied to. And I said to him, but, you know, he says, don't trust history. And I said, how do you mean? He says, okay, what's your granddad's name? And I told him, he says, what's your great granddad's name? And I didn't know. And he said, that's your great granddad and you don't even know his name. How can you take anything else as fact? You know?
That's a good point. Yeah. And I think those veterans of World War II, I can remember my uncle said something similar, but because he knew what I was like, when I said to him, oh, tell me, because he said World War II was not how it was presented. Yeah. You know, in other words, the whole spirit of the Blitz and everything else. And I said, oh, tell me more, Uncle. And he sort of looked at me and thought, nah. He knew what I was like.
Nobody ever wants to go off to war. Well, my dad said there was people coming around in vans and dragging people out of their houses and everything, you know. So, I mean, you never see that in the movies. But like you say, I mean, the celebrities, the same as the media, you know, whenever there's a war, the drum bangs in Hollywood, turns out, whether it was John Wayne during Vietnam or now modern celebrities for every war that the military-industrial complex want to wage.
Yeah. And as I say, it's a fascinating subject. And of course, the whole problem with these relatively unknown or even relatively obscure subjects is how do you dramatize them? Because we're all so familiar with the safe stuff. You know what I mean? What should we say? The assassin who's fed up killing, but he's going to do one more killing, and or the rogue CIA department who hire an assassin, and inevitably, of course, the United States is in grave danger from, and that's usually some kind of crazy fanatic, and previously it might have been Islamic, and possibly now it's probably Russian, and so on, and so finding an angle. Was quite challenging for me. And then the second one was, I don't know about you, but I don't particularly want to write in a bubble. I know there are people who go, oh, wow, that's really sort of Pilger-esque, or that's kind of, but I want to try and appeal to that middle of the road audience. So because Charlie's War had that advantage of appealing to people who weren't particularly left-wing or right-wing or anything. And that's still the case to this day. So that's my role model, which means I have to throttle back a bit. So I'm sort of confiding in my thinking here, but when I'm writing it, I'm thinking, well, maybe I'll tone that down a little bit, because I want to reach that what could be called a middle-of-the-road audience, as opposed to people who, are already committed to, what should we say, a radical perspective on history.
I think Charlie's War to me is just pro-human. It's not left or right. It's just pro-human, isn't it? And that's the best type of writing. And I read it before I knew who you were. I read it as a kid, and I remember loving it, and it was getting passed around my class at school. People really enjoyed it. Another thing of yours I love that we haven't talked about at all is martial law. And I know it's so unbelievably influential. See, my generation of guys like me, Warren Ellis, Garth Ennis, and everybody, I mean, there was only 6 of them out at the time, and everybody was talking about it and everybody was inspired by it and everything, I don't think there's a story I've written in 20 years that you can't trace something back to a martial law moment, I think. And I think all of my guys were the same. It was like, it must have been how punk felt in 1976. Like, it was just a comic unlike anything the Americans were doing. And, how did it get down at the time? Because I was in my little bubble in Scotland just reading it as a fan, What did the Americans make of it? How did that go? Because that's the most radical comic I think I've seen from an American publisher at the time.
I think it's a good example of the fox getting in with the chickens, isn't it? and I think you can probably feel my brain whirring the same way on MI7. It's another example of a fox is still trying to get in with those chickens. But it's the same kind of thinking. I think trying to keep it relatively brief, it's probably fair to say we didn't do it deliberately, but Marvel didn't realize what they were getting.
Right.
And we'd already signed the contract. And in that sense, it could be seen that we suckered Marvel. Now, Archie Goodwin, one of the all-time greats of comics, I think if he got any kind of flack from up high, or if he felt any personal negativity over it, he certainly kept it to himself. And but it was hard to know. But once they realized what it was, and because it was Marvel epic as opposed to Marvel period, which was always experimental, so they never discouraged us in any way. In fact, I think obviously once we were established, we just got worse and worse, and a lot of that I think is arguably down to Kevin, because his knowledge of superheroes is profound and mine is quite minimal. So initially, when it came out, it went down very well sales-wise. It's the usual story, artists being slow. So we lost some momentum because Kevin was a fastidious artist and put so much detail into it and so forth. But I think for the most part, it was all well received. I think there were occasional people who perhaps took considerable exception to it. Perhaps not appreciating that if it's the villain who's behaving in a villainous way, we're not saying that this is the way to behave, but so the one that springs to mind is one particular superhero saying to a lost kid, whatever it was, let's say it's San Jose, which direction is that? And the kid says, over there. And then the superhero drop kicks him.
That's right.
Way. And I mean, it's black comedy of a kind that's, I don't know. I mean, it was accepted generally, black comedy, when martial law came out. But I would have thought even more so today, things like The Simpsons and so on. And, but anyway, I think there was a comic shop owner in Texas who took huge exception to it. The one that probably, I think, made our peers cross, and they thought it was mean-spirited, which of course it was, and rightly so, was Kingdom of the Blind, which was...
I love that, the Batman one.
Yeah. I mean, that was... it was really raising a point which has come up recently with some celebrities about, the nature of what is Batman. I mean, is someone like Jeff Bezos going to go out there and be a hero in this particular way and so forth? So it dealt with a lot of important truths, I think. And that one, certainly, I think, my peers in the business didn't like it, which, of course, just made Kevin and I worse. You know what I mean?
I think it was 20 years ahead of its time, though. I think, because my generation of guys adore it. It's constantly referenced, and you can see it in all of our work as well. But I love that thing you do a flip and everything. And I try and do that, I did a thing where Superman's rocket lands in Russia instead of the USSR instead of landing in Kansas, And I think that's something you always did so brilliantly. Like, it's a superhero hunter. It's not a superhero. It's the alien's the good guy, in Nemesis and so on, I love that because you always have a fresh take on things. And that's what is interesting is we all headed to America and we were trying to make our fortune in the States. Like I said earlier, you went to the EU. Now, what drew you to those albums? Were you like a big fan of 60s and 70s European comics, or was it just something that later kind of came into your sphere? What happened there?
Well, the whole thing was that 2000 AD was heavily, heavily influenced by European comics and by American comics that had a strong European connection. I'm thinking Warren comics, 1984 and Weird and Eerie and so on. And so we were all of us very influenced by European comics. And
so you were reading that stuff growing up then? Yeah, you were reading?
No, not really. No, I mean, pre-comics, I never read a comic. I barely read a comic.
That's interesting.
Probably count them on one hand.
Right.
Barely. No, I love cartoons as a kid. So I was an avid... I'd read Punch every week, Private Eye every 2 weeks, and so on. I love cartoons, and I love the satire that went with it. Yeah. And I would also go in for Mad magazine. But otherwise, no. But at that time, when Battle was being created and all the others, there was a strong European connection because... the pound was strong, and therefore you had brilliant artists like Esteban Maroto working for these very pulp comics because the pound was great for them. Yeah. And so I became familiar with these things, and I sort of was aware of Don Lawrence, for example, going to, I think it was Holland with Storm, and I would look at these European albums, and it sometimes seems now almost an inevitable process that my peers would have gone to the States just as your generation went to the States, but it wasn't inevitable. In fact, we were all lined up for a French project. Brian Bolland, Dave Gibbons, myself, Mick McMahon, Kevin O'Neill, Ian Gibson. We were lined up to do a project for Dargo.
Right.
And which didn't work out. But if it had, history would have been very, very different because those artists would have, and myself, we would have all got the benefit of a very, very good deal because the French business model is, I mean, the American business model is certainly better than the British one. The French one is best of all. I mean, they have a love of the arts that's reflected in percentages and so forth. So,
what year was that, Pat? Sorry to go back. Like, what year
around when 2000 AD kicked off. In other words,
that early, yeah. Wow.
Yeah, that early. We submitted a project to Dargo, the people who did Asterix.
Yeah.
In what would it be, 1978, something like that. And we got screwed around. I mean, as happens with publishers, it's the usual story that could happen anywhere. but then but I had always, when I would go into comic shops, I would immediately go to the bande dessinée section. I'm thinking of the early Forbidden Planet, and they would have a wonderful section. And I say, oh my God, this artwork is brilliant. It might be science fiction, like, say, Drouillet, Lone Sloan Delirious, Mobius, etc., or it might be Westerns like Blueberry and so forth. But there was just so much great material. And what I loved about it was the higher quality of the product. And this is my current series, right? So this is Requiem, and you can see what I mean.
They look great. The big hardcovers, I love them.
Yeah, it's the hardcovers. It's the high quality of the artwork. Yeah, and it's just trying to open a page. Yeah, it's the quality of the artwork. It's just, now, admittedly, this artist that I'm working with, Olivier Ledoir, he is probably, I don't know, he's I mean, 10,000 people came out to see his exhibition at Angoulême. So he's probably one of France's greatest fantasy artists. But I would see precursors to Olivier. I think this is what I'd like to do creatively, because it's this is beautiful work. It hasn't got that ephemeral quality that a lot of British and American comics have, or certainly at that time. And so, I'm heading for Europe. And what actually did it really was The Horned God with Simon Bisley.
It was a beautiful European album. I saw it out there.
Yeah, because previously there'd been understandably a lot of resistance to British material. But once The Horned God came through, other 2000 AD stories broke through as well. Not that many, but enough. And so 2000 AD stories, notably Charlie's War, Slain, and so forth, now sell throughout Europe. And the great thing, which we were talking about on Twitter, was that the French market is stable. Of course, it's a hard one to say to any new writer or artist, go for France, because, my God, there are certain criteria there. And maybe I was just lucky or whatever. But there's certain things they want which don't necessarily apply to Britain or America. For instance, the French love backgrounds. So as we both know, there's a lot of British and American artists who backgrounds aren't really their thing. And now you could say the other way around, of course, is that arguably Anglo-American art and stories, that the heroes are much more defined. They're almost to the point of being ludicrous. Whereas in French comics, they can fade a little bit into these wonderful Baroque backgrounds. So there's always that danger. But the French market is solid, and they really know what they're doing. And I think, and I don't pretend to be an expert on this, I mean, you may well know far more about this than I do, but I get the feeling that, if you like, the energy is in France, and perhaps is not so strong, certainly in the UK. So, for example, Manga has really lifted from France. I'm sure there are UK mangas, but there's a lot of energy behind that. And the next one that I want to try, which actually would be a bit like going back to school, but it's what my muse wants me to do, so I've got no choice. I have to do "You Must Be Obeyed." Our webtoons, these where you follow the comic on your mobile phone, and you're scrolling down and so on. And some of them look awful. especially if you've been looking at something like this.
Yeah.
How do you turn such complexity as this into, how do you reduce it down? Surprisingly, some of it is possible. Not Requiem. There's no way you could do that. But it's not. It doesn't have to be quite as what shall we say, as overly simplified as some examples of web. Some examples are, you wince when you see them. You think, why are kids looking at this? But I can sort of understand it. You're on your way to school or something, and you're scrolling through it, and you get into a story. Yeah. I mean, they're huge in Korea, which is where it originated. And as far as I can tell, they seem to be working in France. Whether they would work in the UK is another matter. We are very fussy in the UK.
No, it's funny because the manga scene obviously has been enormous in the UK and wiped out the American comic scene. I mean, the American originated sales are a fraction of what the manga sales are. But somebody said to me that it's actually eaten into the European market as well, to the detriment of European produced work as well. Is that something you've felt when you're out there? Do you feel the French originated stuff and so on has started to decline slightly in terms of numbers when you walk into a bookstore in Europe, the same way that we see it in Britain and America?
It's been a while since I've checked that out, but I would imagine it has a bit. But I think the French are so, bande dessinée, comics, and so on are so much part of a French way of cultural life. That they will embrace manga and use it for their own ends. Like, for instance, someone was saying to me, "Oh no, manga has to be produced by a Japanese artist." And I'm sure there are many examples which challenge that viewpoint. And one of the series, we're actually doing a manga. We actually commissioned a manga version of this. And it's probably a good thing because it's Requiem is probably aimed at, it is aimed at older readers. You've probably got to be 17 plus. And I would think the very act of drawing it in a manga style will take away some of the erotic nature of it and some of the violence and so on. It becomes much more linear. I think it's going to be in black and white. I imagine it'd be one of these telephone directory size books or something. But it won't be drawn by a Japanese manga artist. It'll be drawn by someone elsewhere. And so I think they've moved with the times. I think the French really have moved with the times, whereas I think in the UK, the feeling I get is they try rebellion and perhaps they succeed from time to time in pulling in some of those new generation of readers. But I think primarily it feels to me like it's a nostalgia audience, which is fine if that's the model that works for them. But I find the whole thing very exciting to actually work for something we haven't touched upon, but I think is really worth saying that I particularly like working for a juvenile audience. I say juvenile, what would you call them? 14, 15, something like that. Because they don't know who the hell you are. So they're because we've all of us produced work where, I don't know, a fan is in their 30s will say, well, that's not Pat's best stuff, but it's still Pat. So, okay, or whatever. But a 15-year-old is going to go, well, I like it or it's crap. You know what I mean? They're not going to mess around. So you get a very honest answer, and they're open to new ideas in a way that I think probably all of us in different ways. We there's a cutoff point where I'm not taking on board anything new. You know what I mean? And so I find that really exciting. And we did because of COVID, it turned out to be a one-shot although we're just in the process of doing a sequel, Spacewalk, which we used for the newsstand audience. Mm-hmm. And it was really gratifying to get comments from 14-year-old kids, male and female. It was really good. And I don't know, there's an energy about it. Yeah. Whereas and also it's much more cutting edge. If they don't like something, they can be quite cruel.
It's funny, I was at the beginning of all this, I said to you, what is it that keeps you so fresh? Because you're always fresh, right? And I realize what it is just from talking to you for a couple of hours, is you have always maintained an interest in everything and what's coming next. You never rest on your laurels. You don't look back. So I remember years ago, it was Dice Man and Crisis and Toxic, and you're trying all these new things. Now it's webtoons and European graphic albums. You know, you never stop. Now you're thinking about your manga comics. And I love that. And I just think, see, as a guy who does the same job a wee bit later down the line, it's a tremendous inspiration. You know, like that's who you want to be, you know? So thanks for all the good comics. Thanks for the inspiration.
Much better than Tom Tully. Like we were saying earlier. Good for him, but not a good role model. No, that's great.
What would you say, you know, in terms of people being able to see you, like online and everything, you know, like your Twitter page and everything, what's the details?
Well, it's Pat Mills Comics for, wait a minute, let me just risk looking it up. Yes, at Pat Mills Comics. That's the, wait a minute, are you there?
Yep, I'm here.
For some reason, I can't see you. My God, I really, wait a minute, let me just, what went wrong there? That shouldn't have gone wrong. Let me just,
if you can still hear me, though, I'm good.
I can still hear. Yeah, I can still hear you. Should I risk pressing buttons?
Oh, and if you don't see me, just picture one of the proclaimers.
Yeah, I'm nervous to press any buttons.
Yeah, let's not.
Yeah, we're tempting fate too much. I really thought just looking up, just double checking my Twitter account. But the other place where people can find me is on iconoblast.
Right.
.substack.com.
Fantastic.
And that has everything on there as well.
Brilliant. And what's the next thing we can look forward to? What's the next thing you've got coming out?
Oh my God. Let me see. What would it be? I suppose, Requiem 12 would be the next thing. And that's coming out in April. Now, the thing is, we have the rights to do the English language digital edition.
Right.
And Requiem 12 is going to be a really big book for us because Olivia had been working on other projects for a while, and now he's come back to Requiem. And this one has gatefolds in it. I think from memory, it has about 2, maybe even 3 gatefolds. So it's going to have these wonderful vistas of his fantastic work. And I think it's going to be amazing. And so that's due out, I think, March, maybe April, I think, early April, maybe end of March. So that's our next big project, if you like.
Brilliant. I'll look forward to it. Well, listen, thanks again for taking the time. I'm going to go and get my dinner now. I don't know what time is it over in Spain. Is it about 7:30 out there? Yeah.
We're an hour, and I'm in a similar situation to you. I'm going off to get my dinner. So listen, thanks so much, Mark, and it's been really absolutely fascinating. And I think we covered a lot of things that I think all our readers will find of great interest.
I think so. The next one we do with somebody else is going to have a high bar here. This was great. But thanks again, Pat. And I hope to see you at one of these European shows.
Well, you and me both, and you'll see from that article I sent you about the French current state of play that it's actually very positive. And somewhere down the line, there's probably something that you're involved with that might be relevant to, bande dessinée or webtoons and so on. And yeah, I think it's up to all of us, really, isn't it, to kind of do what we can to boost the market, because certainly some of, what shall we say, the UK and US publishers seem to have, I don't know, they seem to be treading water. So it seems to be up to all of us to kind of stimulate the market, I guess.
Well, the energy always moves somewhere. You just have to find where the energy is,
That's very well put, and that's exactly how I feel. As long as you follow the energy, it's always out there somewhere. And the really encouraging thing, I think, about the French market is that it shows that comics are very much alive and well. And it's no good saying, well, France is different. You know what I mean? It's it's an international enough society that some of those lessons that the French could teach us could apply to the UK and perhaps the US to refire the markets a bit.
I see it in-house. I mean, the global market's so interesting. In-house at Netflix, 2 of the 3 biggest shows at Netflix as an American company. One's a Korean show, one's a Spanish show. And it's
I was thinking of that. Yeah, we're much more of a global society culturally, and it's if the countries of traditional origin don't deliver, well, the muse is going to move on and find someplace else. So it's I've certainly seen that on your on the Netflix catalog. But there's several Korean hits, haven't there?
Oh yeah, it's huge. Yeah, it's great. Well, listen, I better go and we'll get our dinners. But brilliant talking to you, Pat, and I hope to see you soon.
You too. Cheers.
All the best.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.